They called it the Flying Fortress, a machine of steel and fire that symbolized American air power in World War II. With its bristling guns and near-mythical reputation, the B-17 was hailed as invincible. But the truth was far darker. Of the crews who climbed inside its belly and took to the skies over Europe, thousands never came back. For every story of a battered bomber limping home, there were countless others reduced to fireballs in the sky. The men inside weren't just facing enemy fighters, they were battling freezing altitudes, exploding oxygen lines, and a terrifying reality where survival rates often dropped below 30%. And yet they kept flying. In this video, we'll uncover the myths, the sacrifices, and the chilling realities of the B-17, truths that were buried beneath its legend. By the end, you'll understand why this so-called fortress was both a savior and a coffin. When the Boeing B-17 first rolled out in 1935, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The sleek, all-metal bomber bristled with machine guns jutting from its nose, tail, dorsal turret, and sides. A Seattle newspaper reporter coined the phrase "flying fortress" after seeing its defensive armament, and the name stuck. On paper, it looked untouchable. The idea was simple. Instead of sneaking bombers in at night, the U.S. Army Air Corps would send massive daylight formations of B-17s deep into enemy territory. With so many guns covering every angle, the theory was that German fighters would be shredded before they ever had a chance to get close. It was a bold vision, one that promised to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. But from the start, there was a darker reality lurking beneath the propaganda. Each B-17 cost roughly $200,000 at the time, a staggering figure. But what couldn't be measured was the cost in human lives. Crews of 10 men, mostly in their teens or early 20s, were crammed inside the bomber. They were told they'd be flying in a near-invincible fortress, but in truth, its armor was thin, its engines vulnerable, and once the Luftwaffe realized how the bombers flew, German pilots adapted quickly. The reality of war would prove that the Flying Fortress was not always the fortress its name promised. Even in the design stage, engineers knew the gamble they were taking. The B-17's emphasis on long-range and heavy bomb loads came at the expense of crew protection. And while generals imagined massive formations tearing across the skies, they overlooked the terrifying truth. When the enemy swarmed, there was no such thing as perfect coverage. Gun arcs overlapped, blind spots appeared, and enemy fighters found ways to exploit them. This would set the stage for some of the highest casualty rates of the war, a truth that young airmen would discover all too soon. When America officially entered the war in late 1941, the B-17 was thrust into combat almost immediately. Early missions over occupied Europe and North Africa revealed just how dangerous daylight bombing really was. Crews flew at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen masks froze, guns jammed, and frostbite ate away at exposed skin. The romanticized vision of clean, surgical bombing quickly gave way to a nightmare of flak bursts and fighter attacks. In 1943, during the early raids into Germany, the reality of the B-17's survival rate became impossible to hide. The mission to bomb the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Regensburg, for instance, turned into one of the most infamous disasters of the air war. Out of 376 bombers sent, 60 were shot down, and over 600 men were killed or captured in just a few hours. Survivors described the sky as a metal graveyard, with burning planes tumbling through formation and men parachuting helplessly into enemy territory. The promise that massed firepower would protect the crews was proven fatally wrong. Inside the bombers, the experience was hellish. Flak shrapnel tore through fuselages, severing limbs, puncturing lungs, and shredding oxygen tanks. When a bomber's oxygen line blew, crewmen could lose consciousness in seconds and die quietly at their stations. Enemy fighters, particularly the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190, dove head-on into formations, spitting cannon shells at cockpits and bomb bays. Crews were told they had to survive 25 missions before being rotated home, but most didn't make it that far. In 1943, the average crew member's odds of surviving all 25 missions were less than 1 in 4. And yet, what's even more haunting is how these missions were sold to the public. Newspapers back home told stories of indestructible planes limping back with engines on fire and wings shredded by flak, which did happen. But what the papers didn't say was that for every heroic return, dozens of planes never came home at all. The myth of invincibility was maintained, while the cemeteries in England filled with rows of young airmen. To understand the dark truth of the B-17, you have to step inside the bomber itself. It wasn't just a plane, it was a cramped, freezing, rattling death trap. The crew of 10 men each had specific roles: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and 5 gunners spread across the aircraft. They worked in near silence, the roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines drowning out everything, while the air inside the fuselage dropped well below freezing. At high altitude, oxygen was life itself. Men wore bulky heated suits, leather gloves, and heavy helmets. But still, frostbite was so common that crews joked about leaving fingers in Germany. The nose gunner and bombardier had some of the most exposed positions, lying on their stomachs in plexiglass domes while enemy fighters tore head-on into the formation. The tail gunner, crouched alone in his tiny pod, often never saw death coming. If the tail was hit, he usually had no chance of escape. What made the B-17 so horrifying for its crews wasn't just the enemy, it was the plane itself. Fire was the deadliest fear. A single round could ignite fuel lines or oxygen tanks, and within seconds, the bomber became a fireball. Men often had to choose between burning alive or jumping without a parachute. Survivors recalled seeing friends engulfed in flames, pounding at escape hatches that were too jammed to open. Others froze to death after bailing out at high altitude when their parachutes deployed too early in the frigid air. Even when the plane made it back to base, the trauma stayed. Crews stumbled out covered in blood, with empty seats where friends should have been. It was said that every mission took years off a man's life. The sound of flak, the smell of burning fuel, and the sight of shattered bodies haunted them long after the war ended. And yet, despite these terrors, young men kept climbing aboard because they were told it was the price of victory. If enemy fighters were terrifying, the true nightmare for B-17 crews came in the form of anti-aircraft fire, known simply as flak. Entire missions were structured around punching through skies blackened with exploding shells, where every moment could mean death. The German 88mm guns were so precise and devastating that bomber groups often described their missions as flying into a solid wall of black steel. Crews would sit in their positions, the bomber shuddering as flak bursts shook it violently, waiting to see if this explosion would be the one that tore through their fuselage. A single direct hit could rip open a B-17 like paper, blowing men out of their stations in an instant. Statistically, flak accounted for nearly half of all B-17 losses over Europe, and unlike fighters, there was no way to shoot back. The helplessness ate away at morale. Crews compared it to sitting in a coffin while someone hammered nails into the lid. Even worse, the bombers had to maintain tight formations, meaning they couldn't dodge incoming fire. To leave the formation was to die alone, and so they held steady, trapped in flying targets, watching comrades explode into burning fragments just yards away. The dark truth here is that crews were told the B-17 was tough enough to survive the flak gauntlets, but the reality was grim. Surviving 25 missions was statistically nearly impossible in the early years. Imagine boarding your bomber knowing that each run was a lottery, not of glory, but of mutilation, death, or survival, with scars you'd carry for life. And yet they flew anyway. Later in this video, we'll dive into the psychological impact of watching entire crews vanish in seconds, and how men carried that trauma long after the war was over. Even if the guns of the enemy somehow missed you, the skies themselves could kill you. B-17 missions were typically flown at altitudes of 20,000 to 30,000 feet, where temperatures could plummet to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The bombers were unpressurized and poorly insulated, meaning every gunner, navigator, and bombardier was exposed to the brutal cold. Heated flight suits often malfunctioned, leaving men frozen stiff at their guns. Fingers could stick to the frozen steel of machine gun handles, noses and ears blackened from frostbite, and oxygen masks would often ice over, suffocating men mid-mission. If an oxygen system failed above 20,000 feet, a crewman had just minutes before hypoxia set in. There are chilling accounts of men slowly slumping over, their faces turning blue as they died without a sound, unnoticed until someone shook them. The inside of the fortress became a tomb of frozen bodies on more than one occasion. Worse, when enemy fire hit the oxygen tanks, the result was catastrophic. Explosions that incinerated entire crews in seconds. This was the dark secret no recruiter mentioned. Nature itself was a ruthless executioner. Crews would often say the B-17 was not only a machine of war, but a machine of suffering. Each mission forced men to gamble not only against flak and fighters, but against frostbite, suffocation, and the brutal conditions of the high atmosphere. Later, we'll explore how these conditions created psychological scars, as men came to fear the cold and silence of altitude as much as the enemy's guns. At its core, the B-17 was built for one thing: strategic bombing. The theory was simple. If enough bombs were dropped on factories, rail yards, and cities, the enemy would collapse. But the truth was far darker. Each mission required tight formations of hundreds of B-17s, each one carrying up to 4,000 pounds of bombs. But accuracy at 25,000 feet was abysmal. Even under perfect conditions, bombs scattered widely. Factories were missed, and civilians became the true targets of the flying fortress. Crews wrestled with the moral burden of knowing their bombs were killing women, children, and the elderly. Many were told not to think about it, but the sight of firestorms engulfing entire cities haunted them long after the war. In one mission over Hamburg, eyewitnesses described oceans of flame, where tens of thousands burned alive. The B-17 had earned its nickname as a fortress in the sky, but to those below, it was a harbinger of apocalypse. And still, the math was brutal for the men inside. Early in the campaign, the odds of a crew completing their 25-mission tour were less than 20%. Some units lost half their men in a single week. The bombers may have symbolized American strength, but behind the propaganda lay an unrelenting slaughter. Every empty bunk after a mission told the truth. The B-17 wasn't just a fortress, it was also a flying coffin. As we move further into this story, we'll look at the survivors, the men who somehow lived through their tours, and the heavy price they paid long after their war was over. Those who somehow survived their 25 missions were hailed as heroes, but survival came at a cost that could never be measured in medals. The men who climbed out of their bombers after their final mission carried scars that went far deeper than the frostbite on their fingers or the burns on their skin. They had witnessed their friends blown apart by flak, seen entire crews vanish in mid-air fireballs, and carried the stench of burned flesh and frozen blood in their memories. These were the things they could never speak about when they returned home. Psychologists at the time were only beginning to recognize what we now call PTSD. Back then, it was dismissed as battle fatigue. Men were expected to simply return to normal life, get jobs, start families, and put the war behind them. But the nightmares didn't stop. Many described hearing the engines of the flying fortress in their dreams, waking up to phantom explosions or smelling smoke where none existed. Some veterans admitted that they could never step on an airplane again, while others carried survivor's guilt so heavy it destroyed marriages and careers. One navigator, reflecting decades later, said, "When I came home, I wasn't really home. Part of me was still up there, in the freezing sky, waiting for the next flak burst." That was the unspoken truth. Survival didn't mean escape. It meant living the rest of your life in the shadow of what you'd seen. For many, their medals gathered dust in drawers, while the ghosts of their lost crews haunted them until their dying day. The B-17's deadliest wound wasn't just the death it caused, it was the living men who came home as shadows of themselves. The name Flying Fortress suggested an invincible war machine, but the reality was far from it. The B-17 earned its reputation for toughness because some damaged planes did make it home, limping back with holes torn through their fuselages, wings shredded, and engines on fire. These miraculous returns became propaganda gold. Photographs of bombers that had been torn to pieces but still landed safely circulated widely, giving the impression that survival was the norm. But this was an illusion. For every bomber that staggered home, dozens were torn from the sky and never returned. The public was fed stories of the bombers' resilience, but airmen knew the darker truth. The fortress wasn't built to keep them alive. It was built to deliver bombs. Crews often joked bitterly that the armor seemed designed to protect the plane, not the men. Fuel tanks were shielded, but gunners sat exposed. Engines had redundancy, but one burst of flak could decapitate a turret operator instantly. The myth of invincibility served to keep recruitment high and morale steady, but among the crews, the truth was whispered in mess halls. The B-17 was as much a death trap as it was a fortress. That disconnect between myth and reality gnawed at veterans. They saw newspaper clippings praising the indestructible fortress while attending funerals for half their unit. They knew the cost was sanitized, stripped of blood, screams, and burning flesh before reaching the public. One gunner later said, "We were flying coffins with wings." The only fortress part was for the folks back home to believe in. The dark truth was that the legend of the flying fortress was built on the bodies of the men inside. As the war ended and the bombers were retired, the B-17 was enshrined as a symbol of American resilience and power. Museums restored them, films romanticized them, and air shows displayed them as proud artifacts of victory. But beneath the polished aluminum skins of those survivors lies a legacy drenched in blood. For the men who flew them, the fortress was not a relic to marvel at. It was a tomb filled with memories of friends who never came home. The legacy of the B-17 is twofold. On one hand, it represents the bravery and sacrifice of tens of thousands of young men who climbed aboard, knowing the odds were stacked against them. On the other, it is a reminder of the brutal cost of strategic bombing. Cities turned to ash, civilians incinerated, and soldiers broken by the psychological torment of endless missions. It's easy to celebrate the victories, but the dark truth lingers in the stories of veterans who never spoke of what they saw or who carried the silence to their graves. Decades later, when asked what it was like, one elderly tail gunner simply shook his head and whispered, "I left my friends in the sky." That single sentence cuts through the myth, the propaganda, and the nostalgia. It reveals the haunting reality that for many, the B-17 wasn't just an airplane. It was the machine that swallowed their youth, their innocence, and their peace of mind. The flying fortress was indeed a weapon that helped win the war. But for those who lived it, the nickname many muttered under their breath was far more accurate: the flying coffin. And that is the darkest truth of all.